All right, so in this video, we're actually going to take what we know about strings and variables, and we're going to look at a concept called formatted strings. All right. So formatting strings has always been kind of a possibility. And when I'm talking about formatting strings, I mean being able to pass variables into a string so that they can kind of update in our code and dynamically give us information about variables. And this has always been something that you can do. So there was a method called dot format on strings. So in particular, if I were to do, my string, let's just say hello, that's a string, and do a dot, that's a string. There's this dot format option where you could pass in formatting specifications. So this was always possible in Python. But in recent iterations or recent versions of the Python programming language, they've introduced a much simpler format for doing this called f-strings. So I want to demonstrate that today. Now, what I'm going to do is, so if you're kind of just following along in these Python basics video, up at this point, we haven't kind of looked at for loops or any type of flow control, but I'm going to go ahead and use some of that, even though we haven't kind of formally seen that, because this would be in the use case where you might see this most often. I really want to demonstrate, formatted strings in a very good use case. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a for loop structure. Now, again, we haven't seen this, so you kind of just follow along. I do think it's relatively straightforward. So even though we haven't formally talked about this, I do believe you'll be able to follow along relatively easily. So let's make a loop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a looping variable called current integer. So I'm going to say for current integer in, and I'm just going to do a range of 10. Now what this is going to do, I'm just going to use a print statement right here to print out the value of current integer. All right. So when we run this, what this is actually doing is printing the integers 0 up to 9. So that's what this range function is doing. It's giving me back 10 integers starting at 0 and ending at 9. So it's not including that last value. So up to 10. All right. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 9. And a lot of times what we're doing when we're writing code, we might be writing, different types of loops, especially if we're doing some type of an algorithm or whatnot. And we will oftentimes, and there's a lot of opinions on whether this is a good practice or not. But the reality is a lot of us will do this is we will use the print statement to debug our code. So we might be interested in seeing what the value of current integer is throughout the execution of this loop, and we might use a print statement. All right, well, this might not be very helpful, right? I mean, if we're looking at this, it could be that we've got a lot of different variables that we're, checking on. So what if we had something like this? So I'm going to say, current square. So for each one of those values, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take current integer and I'm going to square it. All right. And maybe we want to check the current value of the integer and the current square. Right. So if we're doing this with print statements, this gets really jumbled up, right? We got to remember, okay, well, that's current integer, that's current square. So 0 squared 0, 1 squared 1, 2 squared 4, but this is really messy, right? So we might want to, kind of make this look a little bit prettier, so that if we're actually using this to debug, it's a little bit easier for us to just kind of look at it very quickly and understand what's going on. All right, I'm actually going to change this range down to 5 just so it stays in a little bit smaller area. All right, so what you might do is you might say something, well, I know the print statement can take multiple arguments, so could we say something like this, current integer equals, and then give it that, do a comma and pass in current integer as the second argument, and then we could do maybe current square. Right, so that's a little bit better. So we know, well, now that 0 is pointing to current integer and then current square, and so forth. Well, maybe we want the integer and the square on the same line. So we might do something like this. Well, look, now we got to start really thinking about it. We know that the print statement's got this end argument. So maybe we could change the end for this first one to be equal to a string of a period and then a space. So that'll get them on the same line. So current integer 0, current square is equal to 0, current integer 1, 1, 2, 4, and so forth. Or maybe we just want to change that to a comma, right? But now we're having to really kind of sit here and think, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. So f strings can help us with that. All right, so what an f string is let's say that I've got this current integer, or let's just say that I've got my var is equal to 2. All right, so what we were doing before is we were using a print statement, passing in a lot of different arguments and trying to work with these end and the sep and all that to kind of make it look the way that we want. Well, it would be nice if I could just write a string and say, insert the value of my var here. Turns out we can do that. And the way we do that is with f strings. So if we start a string with f, what I can do is start writing. So the value of my var is, and then you can use braces. And this is indicating to Python that, hey, I want to insert a variable here. I can just pass in my var. And now we've got a string representation with this. Okay, so I'm going to take this same loop we did here at the beginning, and let's see how we could use an f string to do this perhaps more succinctly. All right, so instead of it being, current integer equals, I could say, well, let's do f current integer equals current integer, and let's go ahead and put our comma right there. And I'll say current square equals, and we'll do another brace right there. And we got a period. So current integer equals, and then inside my brace, I put in the variable that I want to pass. And then I just continued the string on the other side and place current square there. Oops, let's see, I didn't close it off with my single quote. All right, so let me close that string off. And there we go. So that's basically the same thing that we had previously. All right, now there's some other really, really nice things that you can do. All right, so I want to show you a few of those as far as formatting this output so that it looks very, very good. All right, so first off, let's take the same loop. Well, we've got this current integer thing. So we spent all this time writing out, hey, the value of current integer equals this, right? And current square equals that. In recent versions of Python, they've made it where you don't even have to do this piece of text. You can use, within the braces, you can provide additional formatting descriptors to kind of control how it displays. So what would that look like? Well, let's imagine we take this piece off, current integer equals, and I'm going to take off this current square equals. All right. So now if I print that, it's just printing out those values. So it's still not very helpful. But what if after that current integer, if I put a space equals, and then another space equals, there we go. So if you do this with inside the brace, what it's doing, so current integer equals, it's going to print out the variable's name, and then it'll place its value after the equal sign. All right. And notice that the amount of space that I put around that equal sign controls how much space is around it in the string. So if I were to strip that out, any of those spaces in that first current integer equals, now we don't get those spaces. So we can really fine tune, kind of control that formatting. All right. So that's very nice. All right. So a few other things that you can do is you can, like, let's say that we wanted to try to align these objects here, right? So we notice, okay, well, we got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but maybe we've got some really big numbers. So let's change this from range 5. Let's go to range, 20 to 40. And again, we haven't really talked about the range function, so you're just kind of taking my word for it at this point. All right, so we don't really have as well, good alignment over here on this side. Let's see if we could do some alignment. Well, you can. So if I wanted to do some right, or in this case, right alignment on that variable, I believe we can say, okay, well, in this case, we have big numbers going up to about 4 points there. So let's make it right aligned up to 5 spaces. This should work. There we go. So we've got our right aligned, and then we've got those extra spaces in front because we said do right align and then pad with up to 5 characters, right? So we've got, in these cases, we've got it padded with 2. white spaces or 2 empty spaces, and then here's padded with an extra 1. Right? If we wanted to make it left aligned, we change that sign to that less than sign. So the way to think about it is the direction of that you're pointing. And notice that it's all after this colon. So this colon is providing additional formatting on the numeric part. All right, so I've got a colon, then I'm doing this left align, 5 spaces, and then it does that alignment. You can see it's got that period hanging out because the period is outside that F string. All right. A few other nice things that it can do is, let's say that we've got a really, really big integer. First off, let me show you one other. So we've got right align, we've got left align. So this is left align. So it's almost like an arrow tip pointing to the left. That's how I like to remember it, or an arrow tip pointing to the right. You can also use that caret sign, and this is going to do a center alignment. All right, so this is actually going to be center aligned, even though it's a little bit hard to see because of how I've got things structured, but this is going to be center aligned with padding of up to 5. All right, a few other things that I kind of like is how you can display big numbers. So let's show that here. So let me do my right alignment, or let's do no alignment here, because this is kind of the one thing I don't know if you can do multiple of these formatting in kind of one pass, right? So unfortunately, if you're going to do this right alignment, you might not be able to do this one here because the Python parser starts to get a little bit confused of exactly what type of formatting you're doing. All right, but let's just go back to this equals case, right? So I didn't do any of my alignment, that's okay. But let's do some really big numbers. So let me go, let's say range 100 to, I don't know, let's look at range 100 to 120. Let's actually change it from being a square. Let's do, I'm going to make these smaller numbers. So I'm going to do 2 to the power of whatever our integer is. And then I'm going to make this range go back from, let's say 10 to 30. Let's see if it'll do that. So I'm going to still call it current square. Even this is like an exponential, it's still a square. Let's see what it's doing. So current square is 2. Oh, I'm just doing a multiplication. If I want to raise it to the power, that's going to be that double. There we go. All right, so here's my current square. All right, so we can see these numbers are getting really big, right? So we're doing 2 to the power of whatever that integer is. Well, if you're looking at this visually, it's kind of hard to figure out just how fast that's growing, right? Because you really need, to know where the thousands. So right here, this is 131,000, whereas this is 8.3 million, and this was, I don't know. See, I've got to start counting the digits, right? What if we want to get 1,000 separator? Well, we can, again, use that colon, and you can put in a comma, and that's going to indicate the 1,000 separator. Right, so in this case, that's a lot easier, right? So we see that, hey, that's 16 million versus that's 268 something million. All right, let's just do a real quick check to see if we can still get our alignment characters in. I don't think we can. So if I were to do right align and say, let's do 10 places, right? So it starts to get a little bit odd, right? So it's actually repeating. So that's almost being interpreted as a padding character. Let's see if we were to put that after it. All right, so in this case, it works. So apparently you can do some of those multiple things. There's just apparently an ordering that matters. So there's some documentation. Again, if you were to go to look up in the Python documentation on string methods, they actually have things on, F-style string formatting. So there's a lot of discussion here on some of these modifiers and whatnot that you can use to format. But apparently the order matters. So we did get our nice right align padding right here. We've got our 1,000 separator, so that's good. All right. Let's say that we were dealing with fractional numbers. All right. So I'm going to start another loop right here. Let's just say that we had a list of percentages. So for percent in, and in this case, I'm actually just going to define a list. Again, I know we haven't seen this, but that's going to be okay. Let's just say that these are proportions that, actually represent, some fraction, some ratio or percentage. So now I could just print, and using our F string, we could say, percent equals. That's what we've kind of done up to this point. Well, what if we actually want this to be represented as a percentage with maybe a single decimal point? Well, you can do that with that formatting. Again, you use that colon, and I could use a 0.1, maybe giving me a single decimal point, and you could say, make this a percentage. All right, so 95%, 85%, so forth. If you just want it to be a floating point number with a consistent number of decimal points, and again, if I change this to 4 decimals, right, we get those decimal points there. All right, if I wanted to maybe make this a float with 4 decimal points instead of that percentage, I could say, well, make it 0.4f, and now it's not doing that percentage conversion. All right, so these are kind of just a few things that you can do when you're working with F strings and the print statement in particular. Again, a lot of this, we tend to use this for, maybe debugging. We're in a loop and we want to see what values are. And it's just really helpful to be able to do this in a way that, if you're trying to debug and watch the progress, knowing these formatting options that are available to you can make it where that's actually as least of a painful process as possible, right? Because if I'm printing out these big numbers, well, if I've got to sit here and spend seconds to figure out, well, are we talking about millions, hundreds of millions, tens of millions, thousands? You're not really getting that gain. So use formatting to help make your code as readable as possible for you and for the use case. And we can do that fairly efficiently with F strings. All right, so that's where I'm going to stop this video, and we will continue on in subsequent videos, starting to look at some of these container types like a list in Python.